These are the co-founders of the Unity Mosque in Toronto, Canada. On the left is Al Farouk Kaki, who is also the Imam of the mosque, and on the right is his husband, Troy Jackson. I know these are strange times, but just to clarify, yes, they both identify as men. And no, they're not trolling. They are in fact legally married to one another. This mosque is actually a gay-friendly masjid which doesn't have a dress code, women aren't required to wear hijab, and they always include an indigenous land acknowledgement reference when they pray. And of course, they all share their pronouns before speaking. Yes, progressivism has come for Islam too. This mosque also has affiliate branches in Montreal, Calgary, Ottawa, and Kitchener. And these aren't the only gay-friendly mosques. There's also Masjid Al-Rabia in Chicago, there is the Ibn Rushd Gurtha Masjid in Berlin, and there's one in Paris as well. The response to these gay-friendly mosques from the larger Muslim community has been as we expected. Now, something important to note here is that every single gay-friendly mosque in the world is located in a Christian majority nation. There are none in the Islamic world. Why is that? Is it because Christianity itself is a gay-friendly religion? Obviously not. Is it because there are no gay people in the Islamic world? Again, obviously not. So why are there gay mosques in the Christian world but not even one such mosque among the millions in the Islamic world? Well, the obvious answer is that because there are no liberal democracies in the Islamic world. Find me a Muslim majority nation that allows blasphemy against religious figures, for example. But that answer just kicks the can down the road because it simply begs the follow-up question, why are there no liberal democracies in the Islamic world? Now, this might seem like a silly question given the obvious answer, because Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, wasn't a liberal democrat. Okay, so that's true, but it misses out a large chunk of the answer because remember, Jesus wasn't a liberal democrat either. So why are there so many Christian majority nations that are liberal democracies but no Muslim majority nations? Now, there are entire books written about this very question that go over the historic circumstances of Islam's emergence and expansion and go into detail about how Islamic law or Sharia came to be the way it is. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give you the minimal facts version of this answer. I'm going to explain the two most important factors that led Islam to the state it is in right now. Once you understand these simple but crucial differences between Islam and Christianity, you will be able to understand at a more fundamental level why Islam has ended up being a far more conservative and traditional religion than Christianity. So these main two differences are: 1. Islam emerged after Christianity, and 2. Muhammad was a Jesus who succeeded. Let me explain. So point 1 is pretty simple. Islam emerged around 600 years after Christianity did. But why is this important? It's important because when Muhammad promulgated his religion, he didn't claim it was a new religion. He said his religion was a continuation of the same religion that Abraham, Moses, and all other Jewish prophets preached, and that Jesus was also a prophet in the same line, just like all these other prophets before him. The only difference with Islam was that Muhammad was the final prophet of God. So Islam was the perfected form of the religion that all these earlier prophets were preaching. Okay, so this difference sets up an interesting dynamic between Christianity and Islam. The way Islam views Christianity is categorically different from how Christianity views Islam. According to Christianity, Islam is a false religion and Muhammad a false prophet and a heretic who misguided millions of potential believers away from the Gospels. But according to Islam, while Christianity was good for its time, Islam is the perfected form of Christianity. So it has superseded Christianity now and is superior to it in every way. This point is crucial. According to Islam, the Islamic civilization is entirely superior to Christendom, not by accident of fate, but by God's explicit intent and providence. So the immediate effect of this is that when a new ideological worldview or a new societal practice emerges from within the Christian world and it has no basis in Islamic beliefs, then it cannot possibly be better than what Islam prescribes. It cannot even be equally as good as Islam's teachings. It has to be inferior to Islam since Islam is better than Christianity. I'll get back to this later, but let's move on to point number 2 for now. So point number 2 is Muhammad was a Jesus who succeeded, by which I mean Muhammad succeeded where Jesus failed. Now, obviously, if you're Christian, you don't believe that Jesus failed in any aspect. In fact, even if you're Muslim, you don't believe that, even though you have a different narrative for what happened to Jesus. But let's for a moment look at Jesus' narrative from a completely naturalistic perspective. That is, no miracles, no magic, no angels, no divine intervention, nothing supernatural. If you analyze Jesus' narrative with that perspective, what would you say happened to Jesus? Well, if we were to look at Jesus' story in a completely non-supernatural perspective, then we have to conclude that Jesus was a messianic Jew who was preaching the imminent end of the world to his followers. He then got into trouble with the Romans for causing political turmoil, and like with all other cases of treason, he was publicly crucified. Now, Christians believe that Jesus was only temporarily dead, and he soon returned to life and appeared to his followers. And shortly afterwards, he again ascended to heaven. And Muslims believe that Jesus was never crucified and simply raised to the heavens, and it was actually someone else who was crucified in his place. And the atheist narrative is the naturalistic one I've already described earlier, that he was a nuisance to the Romans and he was put to death for it. The point here is that in all these narratives, the Romans successfully ended Jesus' ministry. That is, the Romans were able to prevent Jesus from preaching his message any further. So my question here is the following. What if the Romans had failed at that? What if the Romans had failed to crucify Jesus? What if Jesus was able to escape the clutches of the Romans and was able to continue preaching to his followers for another decade after the Romans attempted to crucify him? In fact, what if Jesus was able to create his own state during that period and was thus able to implement actual Christian law and morality in that state? How would the Christian world be different today if that had happened? Fortunately, we don't have to imagine the scenario when it comes to Islam, because this is exactly what happened with Muhammad. You see, Muhammad was also preaching in a hostile environment, and the leaders of his community also tried to kill him. But unlike Jesus, Muhammad was able to escape. Now, of course, Muhammad was preaching in Arabia, so his opposition wasn't exactly the Roman Empire at the peak of its power. But nevertheless, according to the Islamic narrative, the heads of numerous clans in the city he was living in decided to assassinate him. Muhammad, however, was able to escape to the neighboring town of Medina, or Yathrib as it was known at the time, and he lived there for another 10 years before he died. And in Medina, unlike in Mecca, he acquired a large following. And it was from there where he launched military expeditions in the last 2 years before his death and expanded his reign extensively, so that by the time he died in 632 AD, almost all of Arabia was under his rule, including Mecca, where he escaped from. So what happened in Muhammad's case was that in his own lifetime, he was able to set up his own state, initially just in the city of Medina and later encompassing the rest of Arabia as well. And what form of government did he set up in this state? Do you think that there is any chance that it was a liberal democracy? Anyway, this is what I mean when I say that Muhammad succeeded where Jesus failed. Muhammad was successful in escaping the authorities who tried to kill him, and he was successful in setting up his own state with his own rules. He agitated the powers in his area and he got away with it. Jesus didn't. So what type of government would Jesus set up if he were able to create his own state? What would the treatment of slaves be in Jesus' state? What about the treatment of non-believers and women? And what would the tax structure be? Well, we don't know. I mean, we can make some educated guesses for some of these questions, but they would still be just guesses. And a million other Christians will have a million other opinions on these same questions. But for Muhammad, we know because he did it. And don't forget, Christians were persecuted for several hundred years after the death of Jesus. There was no Christian state for 300 years after his death, but there was no persecution of Muslims after the death of Muhammad. Within 200 years of his death, the Islamic Empire stretched all the way from modern-day Portugal in the west to Iran in the east. Muslims didn't have to conceal their faith during this time. They were propagating it all over the world. And again, what form of government did the Islamic Empire implement? Do you think there's any chance that it was a liberal democracy? Right. So the question of why there can be liberal democracies in the Christian world but none in the Islamic world boils down to the following two questions. Would Jesus be in favor of a liberal democratic government? And would Muhammad be in favor of a liberal democratic government? For the first question, you can argue all you want, but there is no definite objective answer because none of Jesus' companions asked him this question explicitly, nor did he express his views on this topic explicitly. And why would he? He didn't get far enough in his career to consider what type of government to form, but Muhammad did. Regardless of how Muslims might choose to interpret the Quran and Hadith literature, there is no denying that Muhammad formed a government in his lifetime, and his followers continued it after his death. In fact, for 1,300 years after the death of Muhammad, there was an active Islamic caliphate, and not once in all this time has it ever been a liberal democracy. Even after the caliphate was abolished in 1924, after the defeat of the Ottomans in the First World War, the Islamic world still didn't embrace liberalism. Don't get me wrong, there are some democracies in the Islamic world, but none which are liberal. Find me a country in the Islamic world where blasphemous cartoons are allowed, for example. These democracies only exist in these limited forms because in the absence of an actual Islamic caliphate, a democracy is the least unstable form of government for nations without a massive security state funded by obscene oil wealth. But for the entire duration of Islam's 1,300-year empire, no major scholar of Islam, not one, called for the implementation of liberal democratic rule in the Islamic world. How could they? Not only did Muhammad and his followers not implement liberal democratic rule, it was those inferior Christian nations where liberalism emerged. So it's wrong for two reasons. One, it was never practiced by Muhammad and his followers, even though they had ample opportunity to do so for 1,000 years. And two, it emerged from a faith that Islam had explicitly come to supersede. So obviously the Islamic form of government was better simply because Islam itself is better than Christianity. And this is why you can have gay imams in the Christian world but none in the Islamic world, because it is the Christians who embrace liberalism, and it is liberalism that allows for such freedoms. In fact, even in the non-liberal Christian majority nations like Russia or Hungary, you won't find any gay churches or pastors, let alone gay mosques with gay imams. This behavior is confined entirely to the Western Christian nations, even though there are far more mosques in the Islamic world. Nor do I expect this behavior to change going forward in the Islamic world. 1,400 years of history and unbroken tradition forbids it. A tradition founded by Muhammad himself in his own state with his own government, because he succeeded where Jesus had failed.